Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our series of lectures on scholarly writing for publication. We met last time in lecture 1, and this is lecture 2. And in lecture 1, I promised you that I will come back and take you through a brief description of various terms used in academic research. And as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the depiction of the overall research process in the diagram that I ended with, and in fact, I'll put back this diagram so that you see it. I'm sure now you can see figure 1 on the screen here. So the depiction, as you can see, of the overall research process in this figure and the associated description outlined uses various terms such as, and you can see in the diagram, you have hypothesis. Hypothesis is a term that is being used. Measurement is another term. Research design is another term. And we have so many other terms. So we shall be referring to these terms because these terms form the various aspects of research that a research paper needs to describe through scholarly writing or academic writing, and that's why we are talking about these terms, ladies and gentlemen. So as I have already said, research is a process in which a phenomenon or aspect of reality is examined by following certain norms of science. And in the logic and in the logical positivistic approach, research is a systematic. Research is an objective, and research is empirical. When we say it is empirical, we mean that research is facts-based, is facts-based or data-based examination of phenomenon. So the various steps in research process are designed to make the process systematic, right? To make the process objective and to make the process empirical. So that is very important. So conceptual research is another type of research that is undertaken in academics, ladies and gentlemen. And this type of research seeks to advance knowledge on a topic without collecting and analyzing data and without interpreting the patterns in such fleshly collected data, ladies and gentlemen. So conceptual research typically relies on existing published literature, and based on the published literature, it may advance the existing knowledge in various ways, such as suggesting conclusions based on existing literature, synthesizing the existing literature, or even pointing out gaps in the existing literature, ladies and gentlemen. So thus, only a part of the steps, as we see depicted in figure 1 that is still on the screen here, certainly will be typically associated with this type of research. So that part, as you can see, the upper part, right, brings out the conceptual part of research. And the second part that comes below what I've termed the proposal development there is what we call the empirical research, and not really conceptual research. This type of research takes a research question, makes a plausible conjecture pertaining to the matter of the research question, and then examines whether the reality as reflected in the empirical data supports the conjecture. And if the conjecture is supported in the empirical reality, ladies and gentlemen, then the conjecture statement becomes a statement of empirical fact. Thus, as you can see, empirical studies are data-based, right? So these are studies that are based on data, and they can generate empirical facts. So most of the steps depicted in figure 1, which you still see here on the board or screen, are associated with this type of research. The other terminology that comes up that you need to understand is terminology of knowledge. Under knowledge here really scholarly writing for publication aims at documenting and communicating knowledge. So knowledge, as we defined it earlier on, is justified true beliefs. And here, while the reality being studied typically exists outside a researcher, it comes to be represented inside a researcher's cognition and later in the documented body of knowledge as a statement of belief that is correspondent with empirical reality, ladies and gentlemen. So, in a documented body of knowledge, knowledge is presented as a set of statements, whereas in the mind of the researcher or a reader, it constitutes a statement of belief about an aspect of reality. And in research, the existing knowledge about a topic is reflected in the relevant literature on a particular topic. And this literature may be in various forms, including a research paper, including a book, and new knowledge generated by a study certainly becomes part of new knowledge because of the empirical support or database support found for a conjuncture examined in it. And of course, this adds a bit of new knowledge to the existing body of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. And in this sense, academic and scholarly writing is an empirical paper. And of course, this describes a bit of knowledge that needs to be added to the existing knowledge, and it also describes how that bit of knowledge was generated, ladies and gentlemen. So another thing that I think I need to talk about is theory. Right, because we need to understand what a theory is. A theory is a simplified representation of a limited part of reality. But in the past, I've also told you that a theory is a net that we cast out there in the wide environment to capture a bit of reality out there. So a theory typically includes a set of systematically interrelated statements about the part of reality being represented by it. And these statements, ladies and gentlemen, are of various kinds, including statements that serve as premises. You can even call them assumptions or established principles and so on. And of course, these statements could also specify definitions for terms such as concepts and so forth, which are used in the research process. And of course, statements that specify conjectures referred to as propositions or hypotheses, ladies and gentlemen. And these are always presented in any paper that is published out there or is about to be published. And theories in this case can be described in a textual form using statements, or they can also be documented pictorially by depicting the various aspects of the reality represented through labels referred to as concepts, and the relationship between the various labels indicated through connections referred to as propositions, ladies and gentlemen. So in research process, for developing additional knowledge about the empirical reality, first, a representation of the reality in the form of a theory is developed. From a theory, then certain conjectures or propositions or predictions referred to as propositions and hypotheses can be obtained. And I hope you still remember when we talk about conjectures, we are talking about relation between the concepts, right? And when we talk about hypotheses, then we have reached the level of measuring, right? So certain conjectures or predictions can be obtained either as a part of connections contained in the theory or derived from the theory through further reasoning about what is likely to be observed in the empirical reality if the theory was a correct, right, representation of the empirical reality. Now, this part of research, ladies and gentlemen, that develops a representation of reality derives conjectures from it for subsequent empirical examination, and this constitutes one of the types of research that we call conceptual research, ladies and gentlemen. So let me now move and introduce another term that we shall be meeting from time to time. Remember, I've already told you that conjectures or a conjecture represents a relationship between concepts, while hypothesis represents a relationship between variables, ladies and gentlemen. So concept is a word, or concept is a word that you're likely to meet from time to time, and various aspects of the reality certainly that is being studied in research is usually represented, or those aspects of the reality are usually represented by concepts. So we assign labels, we assign terms to them by providing definitions for the labels and terms. So the labels and terms that we use here to represent events in the reality are what we call concepts. And certainly when we talk about labels, right, and when we talk about a concept, right, we are more or less referring to the same thing, because a concept is a label that describes an event or events out there. So a concept is a term or label which represents in a generalized manner an aspect of the reality. For example, leadership is a concept and it represents an aspect of the reality of the organizational social life. And the term or label leadership and the associated definition jointly constitute the concept leadership, ladies and gentlemen. So the definition of a concept is typically specified using other terms. For instance, the concept leadership may be defined as the process of inspiring others. As another example, ladies and gentlemen, the reality of employees' commitment to an organization, and that's an example I gave you earlier on, is represented in research through the concept of organizational commitment, whereas the concept specification for this aspect of reality includes the label organizational commitment and an associated definition for it, ladies and gentlemen. So similarly, the labels loyalty, customer loyalty, brand image, and innovative strategic orientation, when coupled with their respective definitions, constitute what we call concepts. Thus, in research, various parts of the reality being studied are represented in the form of concepts. And in this case, an integrated view of the reality in terms of interrelationships between different aspects of reality is then provided by specifying relationships among these concepts, ladies and gentlemen. So let's move on to another term that we call propositions. Propositions, ladies and gentlemen, are statements specifying relationship between concepts. I've already said this. For example, the statement that a person's need for power is positively associated with a person's leadership is a statement that specifies the relation between concepts of need for power and the concept of leadership. So this is a conjecture statement rather than a statement of fact. So a conjecture is a relationship that is usually specified to represent how two or more concepts are linked. Right, now, as you can see, empirical research would be needed to examine whether the conjecture statement is actually supported by the data obtained from reality. Now, until empirical research actually concludes the presence or absence of support for a conjecture statement represented by a proposition, it remains a statement of conjecture, ladies and gentlemen. So, once empirical research supports the conjecture statement specified in a proposition, it represents an empirical fact and becomes a statement of empirical fact, ladies and gentlemen. So let's now move to another terminology that you'll meet, and I'll call that a variable or variables. So as I said earlier, concepts like loyalty, organizational commitment, customer loyalty, brand image, name it, right? All these, ladies and gentlemen, maybe innovative strategic orientation and so on, are abstract. So the moment they are at that level of abstraction, they are concepts. So they must be measured And for them, when they are measured, they become variables, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why I'm saying, since concepts form parts of a proposition, in order to test whether the reality is actually correspondent with the propositions, one has to collect data about the aspects of reality represented by the concepts. For instance, to assess whether the proposition need for power is positively associated with leadership actually corresponds with the reality, one needs to collect data from several individuals on their need for power and on their leadership, and see if there is a positive correlation between the various values obtained or data obtained from several individuals on measures of need for power and leadership. So for this empirical verification process to occur, ladies and gentlemen, first, some measurable indicators need to be associated with the concept. Now, these measurable indicators associated with the concept are referred to as a variable or referred to as variables. For instance, one measurable indicator of leadership concept could be the extent to which a person's structures other person's work in terms of setting goals and describing the procedures for obtaining those particular goals. Now, in this example that I've just given you, the number of behaviors, right, of a person of setting goals for others constitutes one measure of a person's leadership behavior, and in this sense, the number of goal-setting behavior is a variable that seeks to measure the concept of leadership in this case. Now, we are using this as an example, and similarly, the concept of an employee's organizational commitment can be measured through the variables of the number of years an employee has served the company, or through the variable of amount of pay increases the employee would decline from another organization in order to remain with the existing organization. Now, this variable could be seen as variable indicators that assess the extent of a concept manifestation in the empirical reality, so that concepts become measurable, ladies and gentlemen. So concepts are abstract, right? And these are the tags or the labels we peg to the reality out there. But for us to go out and verify empirically, we need to measure these particular variables. So these concepts. So when you reach that level of measuring, right, then you are no longer talking about concept, but you are talking about variables, ladies and gentlemen. So you'll be meeting that word from time to time. So let me introduce another new word, terminology that we call hypothesis, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what is a hypothesis? What are hypotheses? Now, if it is one, it's a hypothesis. If there are many, hypotheses. Now, hypotheses are statements that specify relationship between variables, right? So, if you are talking about hypothesis, those statements that specify relationship between variables are referred to as hypotheses. And these are statements of conjecture, indicating what relationships are expected or plausible, ladies and gentlemen. So only when these conjecture statements are empirically verified and found to be supported by empirical data that they become statements of fact. Otherwise, they remain as statements of conjecture, ladies and gentlemen. And there is a similarity between this description of a hypothesis and the one provided earlier for a proposition. But I'm sure you can now see the clear difference between these two. For a conjecture, you are talking about concepts being related, ladies and gentlemen. So this similarity that I'm talking about exists because there is a relationship between a proposition and a hypothesis, right? And for a hypothesis at that level, you are really talking about measurable indicators for the concepts. So as certainly described earlier, ladies and gentlemen, it was described that conjecture statements of relationship between the concepts are propositions. Don't forget, conjecture statements, right, of relationships between concepts are referred to as propositions. It was also described earlier, if you recall, that the variables are measurable indicators of concepts. In this sense, there is a correspondence between concepts and variables, ladies and gentlemen. In light of this, when concepts in a proposition are replaced with the variables corresponding to these concepts, then the resulting statements will be, or the resulting statement will be a hypothesis. For example, a proposition that employees' organizational commitment is negatively associated with employee withdrawal from an organization can become a hypothesis that the number of years spent in an organization by an employee is negatively associated with the number of absence days of an employee. In this statement of hypothesis, the concept employees' organizational commitment is replaced with a variable number of years spent in the organization, and the concept employee withdrawal from an organization is replaced with a variable the number of absence days of an employee. In this example, this statement of hypothesis is derived from a statement or proposition by replacing concepts in the proposition with corresponding variables, ladies and gentlemen. So, in practice, as you can see, the distinction between a proposition and a hypothesis is not strictly reflected in the use of labels associated with the concepts and the variables. And this is quite important for us. And this is partly because usually the same label or a term is used to refer to both a concept as well as a variable associated with the concept. In fact, I'll give you an example. Employee commitment is a concept, right? But at the end of the day, there are certain things that you use to measure commitment, like calculative commitment, right? So if calculative is a variable, right, then calculative will form part of hypothesis, while organizational commitment or employee commitment in this case remains to form a conjecture statement. So you can begin by making conjecture statements or propositions, and then from those propositions you actually derive what we call hypothesis. But sometimes there's a confusion between those words, especially where a concept is very close to the measurement items so that you cannot replace it with any other word. So in such situations or circumstances, the hypothesis will be the same as a proposition or a conjecture statement. But if you can operationalize and bring it to that level of measurement, and the two are certainly different, then you can talk about conjecture statements or propositions and hypotheses, and these will be not the same, ladies and gentlemen. Right, so let me take you to another concept that you'll be meeting from time to time, and that's a concept of measure, ladies and gentlemen. Measures. If you pick any journal article, you see you have the background or the introduction, you have literature review, then you go to methodology section and methods, then that's where you'll find measures, ladies and gentlemen. So one of the purposes of associating a variable with a concept is to make the concept measurable, ladies and gentlemen. So we have concepts, but these concepts are abstract and they must be measured. So one of the purposes of associating a variable with a concept is to make the concept measurable. For instance, the concept employee commitment to an organization is not directly measurable, and hence a variable, a number of years spent in an organization by an employee, which can be measured, is associated with this concept and it serves as a measurable indicator of this concept. Now, for some concepts, such measurable indicators may be readily available. However, in other cases, it may be necessary to devise a special means for measuring the presence of a concept's attributes in the reality for two reasons in this case. First, readily available indicators may not be adequately may not adequately measure the concept. For instance, they indicate a number of years spent in an organization, may not adequately reflect the concept of employee commitment to an organization because it may reflect other aspects such as employee inactivity in looking for employment opportunities in better organizations. And second, ladies and gentlemen, for some concepts, an indicator corresponding to a concept may not be readily available. For instance, the concept of a sense of meaning in work may not have a readily available indicator or variable through which it can be measured. And for such reasons, ladies and gentlemen, instead of using a readily available indicator, a special device may need to be designed to measure a concept. So such device is termed as a measure. Now, typically, in the behavioral areas of management, such a measure would be in the form of a scale that requires a respondent to provide responses on a predefined response format to a set of scale items, ladies and gentlemen. Now, each response option within a response format has a distinct score associated with it. And the scores associated with the respondents' responses to individual items in the scale are added up to arrive at the total score, ladies and gentlemen. So this score reflects the total score on the variable corresponding to the concept that the measurement scale is seeking to measure. So such scales are developed through a process called scale development, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, a scale would typically contain a set of scale items or statements which describe some aspects that are relevant to the concept being measured, a response format with a set of response options ranging from high magnitude to low magnitude, for example, strongly agree to strongly disagree, etc., and directions and the directions to help the respondents to make responses to the items on the scale, ladies and gentlemen. So such scales, which are devices for obtaining a measure of a concept, are referred to as measures or measurement. Now, the process of developing such scales is typically referred to as scale development, and at times it is also referred to as measurement design or operationalization, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me now to take you to another terminology that you will meet, and that terminology is referred to as research design. Now, the term research design can have two interpretations. First, it could refer to the plan for collection of data on various aspects being studied in order to assess empirical support for the hypothesis being examined in a study. And in this sense, the use of the term research design will include specification of the nature of examination, specification of variables on which data is to be collected, specification of the respondents from whom the data is to be collected, the procedures, the timing of data collection on different variables, the number of observations to be obtained, etc. Now, that is the first aspect. The second aspect of research design, ladies and gentlemen, could refer to the process actually used to collect data for assessing empirical support for the hypothesis being examined. Now, the two possible interpretations of the term research design suggest that it could refer to a plan of data collection as well as to the actual process carried out for data collection, ladies and gentlemen. So let me also introduce you to another new terminology that you'll meet from time to time, and that is results and findings, ladies and gentlemen. So in research process, data is obtained through the use of measures and by implementing the steps in the research design. Such data is then analyzed to assess the patterns present in the data, ladies and gentlemen, and this data analysis yields results in a statistical form. For instance, consider testing a proposition that employees' organizational commitment is negatively associated with employee withdrawal from an organization. If suitable scores and suitable scales, if suitable measurement items and scales are developed, right, to measure this concept, the concepts of organizational commitment and employee withdrawal through the use of their respective scales become measurable. And hence the proposition becomes a testable hypothesis. Otherwise, if you leave it at the level of proposition, right, where you cannot derive measures, then it becomes very hard for you to measure, to actually test that proposition. So to test the proposition, if it is still in conjectural and propositional form, then we must convert it into what we call a hypothesis. So to test this hypothesis, data needs to be obtained from a sample of employees on the organizational commitment and withdrawal from an organization through the use of scales which have been developed to measure these concepts. Then data on the measures of these two concepts for a reasonable large number of employees would provide two scores, one on the side of employee withdrawal behavior, and the other one is commitment. So at the data analysis stage, when the relationship between these two scores across the sample is assessed through the use of statistical procedures of correlation assessment, a negative correlation, for instance, may be found between these scores. And the results from the study in the form of an outcome of data analysis in this example, ladies and gentlemen, would be a negative correlation between employee commitment to an organization and employee withdrawal from an organization. And based on this result, the finding on hypothesis testing is that this hypothesis is supported by the study results based on the empirical data. Now, in this sense, findings of a study come out in the form of conclusions on hypothesis testing and indicate the extent to which the empirical reality, as reflected in the results of analysis of the empirical data obtained, is correspondent with the conjectures or propositions and hypotheses about the reality that the study was aimed at examining, ladies and gentlemen. As shown again in our diagram, if you remember figure 1, which again can be placed back on the screen here, or you are still seeing that figure. A finding from the results of data analysis relates back to various initial aspects of the study, such as the research question and the research hypothesis. So let me introduce now another terminology, that is goodness of findings. Goodness of findings. And as you can see, the findings derived from a study in the form of conclusions on the presence or lack of empirical support for a hypothesis are an outcome of the implementation of various steps, such as measurement design, such as selection of respondents, use of data collection procedures, and use of statistical procedures for data analysis, ladies and gentlemen. So the strength and limitations associated with the implementation of these steps are likely to influence the quality of the findings or conclusions derived from a study about the correspondence between the study hypothesis and empirical reality. Thus, empirical research will typically also contain a description on the goodness of findings coming from a research study. For instance, a research paper may describe how the study findings may be applicable to the study sample because of the very specific nature of the respondents from whom the study was collected. And this description will reflect the goodness of findings on one aspect, namely generalizability. How possible is it for you to generalize results to other samples where data was not really collected? Now, similarly, a research paper may describe how the use of a particular measure or a particular data collection method may have had implications in terms of either enhancing or impairing the goodness of a study's findings, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, that becomes very important because the goodness of the measures, the goodness of your results would be in terms of generalization of results. Allow me to introduce a new terminology, implication for research study findings, because you'll find these ones in the papers that you're going to review, the journal articles, whether conceptual and probably empirical papers or state-of-the-art or meta-analytic papers, etc., etc. So we talk about implications of research study findings. Now, conclusions, ladies and gentlemen, derived from a study may suggest implications for at least 4 aspects, namely, 1, implications for the theory from which the propositions and hypotheses were derived, 2, implications for the existing knowledge about the phenomenon being examined, 3, implications for practice, and 4, implications for future research. Now, study conclusions, right, indicating the presence of empirical support for hypothesis have implications for the theory from which the hypotheses were derived, in that they indicate support for the theory as a reasonable representation of reality about the phenomenon, ladies and gentlemen. So further, when the research hypotheses are empirically supported, certain pieces of empirical facts get added to the existing body of knowledge about a phenomenon. And as a result, study findings have implications for the existing knowledge about a phenomenon. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, when the study conclusions add to the existing body of knowledge about a phenomenon, they can also provide some guidelines for those who need to act on the reality. Now, these implications are referred to as implications for practice, ladies and gentlemen. And further, findings of a study can make the existing knowledge of the reality more complete through various ways, such as by adding details to or connections between the various aspects of reality. Now, in light of such new knowledge, new research questions can emerge from which further research may be needed. So such possibilities opened up for future research are referred to as research implications of a study or study findings, ladies and gentlemen. Right, so those are some of the terminologies that I really thought that we could really go through, because we'll be finding these terminologies from time to time. So, given the remaining time, I will try to summarize now a few other things that are very pertinent in scholarly writing for publication. So I want to talk about features of research and research in academic writing. So what are those features of research, and how do they relate to research in academic writing? Now, of course, that brief description that I gave you a few minutes earlier, of course, gave you the connection or relationship between academic and scholarly writing with science and research. And as discussed earlier, science seeks to generate knowledge of certain kinds, and research as a science-based approach to knowledge generation needs to follow certain norms of science. Now, because of this, certain distinctive features are associated with the science and research process, and I've already given you those distinctive features, and I will not really go through those features again. But of course, in academic and scholarly writing, we seek to document research process and its outcome in the form of knowledge generation or knowledge generated, and the earlier discussed features of science and research process result in certain requirements which academic writing seeks to fulfill. Now, the main requirements of academic writing coming from the features of research is that the contents of an academic research paper are required to document the overall research process. As a result, the consequence, right, as a result of the sequence of sections of content in an academic research paper, we find somewhat similar aspects to the sequence of the research method steps which are documented in the figure that I presented to you a few minutes ago. For instance, maybe I'll put back this diagram so that so that you understand exactly what we are talking about. So now I think you can now see this diagram. That is figure 1, right? As you can see, an empirical, for instance, an empirical research paper will start with the literature review. I'm sure you can see where literature review is, right? On the basis of which a research question is specified. Then the theorizing or theory building part, as you can see, is outlined to specify one or more hypotheses pertaining to the research question. These parts of an empirical research paper documents the conceptual part of the research process, and subsequently a separate section outlines the methods adopted for the verification of a hypothesis. I'm sure you can see that on this diagram of figure 1. And this part contains the description of the measurements used to obtain data on the concepts of variables in the hypothesis, the sample of respondents from whom data is collected, right? The data collection procedure used, and the analysis performed. Now this part, ladies and gentlemen, is followed by a part that outlines the results where the outcome of data analysis is described. And thereafter, based on the results of data analysis, study findings in terms of the presence or absence or extent of support for the study hypothesis are described. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, finally, the last part of an academic research paper describes the implications of the study findings for the theory from which the hypotheses were derived for testing, for the existing knowledge about the phenomenon and examination, and for future research and practice. And this brief description of the contents of a typical empirical research paper describes the correspondence between the sequence of research process steps and the structure of an empirical research paper, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this correspondence is there because academic writing documents the process and outcomes of research, and further, some other aspects of science and the research process are also reflected in academic writing through the features of objectivity, public verifiability, the use of existing knowledge for generating new knowledge, etc., etc. And this aspect, or the aspect of objectivity emphasized in science, may get reflected in the language of an empirical research paper, where a researcher may distinguish between what is the reality, possibly as reflected in empirical data, and what is the researcher's own view or opinion about this. So as a result, use of specific phrases such as the data indicates, right, or we inferred, or we infer, have two distinct meanings in an academic research paper, and each conveys a different degree of objectivity. This aspect of the use of specific language allows separation of facts from other subjective aspects such as opinions and views. And as you can see further, the feature of science in terms of reliance on data as the description or as the criteria, as the criteria for assessing of conjunctures is reflected in the language of expression, where a researcher will typically use an expression like the data suggests, or data provides support for the hypothesis, where it is clearly highlighted that the data is the basis of conclusion. So the public verifiability feature, ladies and gentlemen, of science is reflected in the practice where academic research papers typically outlines the description of the various aspects of the research process adopted, ladies and gentlemen. And this description can help the readers of academic research papers to see and verify appropriateness of the methods used in a research study. And the description of the research methods in a research paper may also provide potential for the readers of a research paper to verify whether similar results can be obtained through the implementation of similar research methods steps. Now, the use of existing knowledge as a feature of science is reflected in the feature of research papers where the existing literature is reviewed and summarized in the early part of the research paper to outline the existing state of knowledge in a particular area or discipline. Now, the relevant existing literature is also documented in the subsequent parts of the research paper. And the reason is very simple, because we want to describe the existing knowledge in a literature in order to justify the research question and to facilitate hypothesis specification. It can be seen from the description and the discussion that I've just had with you a few minutes ago, that the contents and the structure and the language aspects of an academic research paper are shaped by requirements coming from the features of science and the features of research. Thus, academic writing can benefit from having some understanding of science, some understanding of research, some understanding of research process, and of the relationship of these with academic writing. I mean the relation between science, the relationship between research and academic writing, ladies and gentlemen. So, various features of scholarly writing or academic writing certainly will be discussed later on. Right, let's move to another area, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be closing very soon in the next 10 minutes. And we are talking about types of academic writing. So, and here we are talking about academic research papers. What are those types of academic writing? Right. So, of course, we have academic research papers, ladies and gentlemen. And academic writing works can be of various types, of which a few are going to be described here, and the rest will be discussed in subsequent lectures. First, academic writing takes the form of a research paper that can be submitted to an academic journal for possible publication. You're aware of that. And such research papers are consistent with the division of research into two parts pertaining to theory building that I mentioned earlier, which comes in the first part of your research, especially if you're able to articulate a research gap, undertake a literature review with an objective of theory building, and then generate hypotheses and propositions and so forth. That material time you're talking about theory building. Then the last part where you come up with the tools and you start measuring these things and you go out and collect data and so forth. And then, of course, that is now the empirical testing part, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why we are saying that certainly research papers are consistent with the division of research into two aspects pertaining to theory building and theory testing. So you first build, go through theory building and then testing. So, and of course, broadly, these get divided into two categories, namely the conceptual research papers and empirical research papers, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in practice, the word research is often skipped from the labels used for these papers, and they are referred to as conceptual papers or empirical papers. But you can actually add the word research. There's no problem with that. Empirical research papers and conceptual research papers. Now, each of these two categories of research papers, each has its own pattern of structure and content. And we'll be discussing these things later on. And as you can see, conceptual papers contain documentation of research works of various types. For instance, a conceptual paper may document the outcome of conceptually processing existing research works in forms such as a review or a synthesis of the existing research works, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why you have these papers like systematic reviews, state-of-the-art reviews, conceptual papers, etc. And that's what we call really, they fall in this category of conceptual papers. And of course, conceptual papers do not involve testing of specific hypotheses, or they don't even involve collection of first-hand data, and they don't even involve collection of fresh data on empirical reality. So such conceptual papers can take various forms, ladies and gentlemen. One form of a conceptual paper can describe a research activity that undertakes a theory building process whose outcome is a theoretical model, ladies and gentlemen, and a set of conjectures termed as propositions and hypotheses. Another form of conceptual paper can document only the review of the existing literature on a particular topic to outline the existing state of knowledge and the required areas of knowledge development on the topic. So that's another type. Now, still another form of conceptual paper can document the review and synthesis of existing literature on a particular topic, ladies and gentlemen. And the above described forms that we have just discussed a few minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen, outline just a few possibilities, and in practice, conceptual paper can take different forms, right? Different other forms, including the ones that I have not really presented. And of course, the reason is very simple. They document various types of research efforts that do not involve collection and analysis of fresh data about empirical reality. Now, empirical papers, ladies and gentlemen, document the process and outcome of a study aimed at assessing whether there is empirical support for one or more hypotheses. But these would typically document brief theory building leading to specification of one or more hypotheses, and then there would be some more text under a section title, methods, or some similar title where various aspects of the research process used in the study are outlined. Now, typically, ladies and gentlemen, these would include the description of the sample of respondents from whom the data was collected, the nature of data collection process, the scales used to measure various concepts or variables in the hypothesis, and the nature of data analyzed in this case, or nature of data analysis which performed in this study. Now, this would be followed by sections reporting the results of the data analysis, findings or conclusions in the form of observed presence or absence of empirical support for hypothesis, discussions of the implications of the study and study results for theory, existing knowledge, future research and practice, ladies and gentlemen. So there we are, and allow me now to take you to the next level of thesis reports and dissertation reports, right? Because we need to understand where they fall, because as a person who is undertaking your studies now, you'll be required to produce a thesis or a dissertation for examination. So students in certain postgraduate academic programs may be required to work on a research project as part of the program requirements. And the process and outcome of research projects carried out for such purposes is documented in project reports. And the term thesis is used in this lecture to refer to a project report. And similarly, as you can see, students pursuing PhD programs are required to complete research projects as a part of their studies. Now, the process and the outcome of such research projects is documented in doctoral dissertation reports. And in this case, a thesis report or dissertation report typically describes three aspects. First, it describes the research questions based on literature review on the topic under investigation or consideration. Second, it describes the research process adopted to address the research question. And thirdly, it describes the data analysis performed on the collected data, results, findings, and the implications of the findings for theory and for the existing knowledge on the topic under consideration. Now, in light of these contents of the thesis reports, ladies and gentlemen, and the dissertation reports, These academic documents can be viewed as a variation of an empirical paper form of an academic documentation described and discussed earlier in our lecture. Now, these two forms of reports would typically contain both a conceptual research part leading to hypothesis specification and an empirical research part describing the process and outcome of the research study as contained in an empirical paper. It is, however, likely that the amount of details covered and the length of description in a thesis or dissertation, ladies and gentlemen, is considerably greater than in an empirical research paper written for an academic journal because of a number of reasons. For example, one, the purpose of a thesis or dissertation is to facilitate examiners' assessment of whether the student has acquired adequate research training and whether the student is able to apply the research training in carrying out independent research. In contrast, the purpose of an empirical research paper is to demonstrate to the journal editor and reviewers that the research question examined in this paper is significant, the research process used is appropriate, and the research outcome is significant. And secondly, in a thesis report or a dissertation, the purpose of the writer would include demonstrating his understanding of a comprehensive body of knowledge pertaining to the topic of the dissertation or the thesis. Now, this may result in the review of very comprehensive literature. In contrast, in an empirical paper, the focus will be on reviewing the relevant literature as it pertains to the research question. Third, many journals specify a limit on the length of a typical empirical paper that can be submitted to them. And most of them now specify the number of words to around 5,500 words, 5,000, sometimes 3,500. Actually, the range between 3,500, 5,000, 7,500, sometimes 8,500. But in rare circumstances, do journals accept manuscripts which have more than 10,000 words, actually 8,500 words. So 7,500 seems to be the average length of these manuscripts. And of course, this requires that the description in empirical papers be concise and the length of the papers be relatively short. Now, academic papers of students for course requirements, right, certainly are important for us to examine here because they are part of the entire process that we are talking about, scholarly writing for publication. So allow me at this material time to take you to academic papers of students for course requirements. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for some courses at the postgraduate level, either master's and PhD, writing an academic paper could be one of the assessment components that are required to be completed by a student for fulfilling the course requirements. Now, such an academic course paper may require students to review literature in a particular area and arrive at some summary or conclusions. Now, this would be similar to the conceptual paper category of academic research papers that was discussed earlier on. But of course, though the level of sophistication, the rigor and comprehensiveness is likely to be less in it than in a conceptual research paper written for a journal, ladies and gentlemen. So academic course papers occasionally may also require students to carry out an empirical study and report its findings in the form of a report. Now, these papers will be similar to an empirical paper category through the level of sophistication, rigor, and comprehensiveness is likely to be less than in an empirical research paper written for a journal, ladies and gentlemen. But all the same, when you are given assignments at the level of PhD and masters, and you are asked to go and review literature and come up with a write-up, this is an exercise that you should value as very, very, very important, because at the end of the day, it helps you gain a skill of scholarly writing and publication. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to move to the last bit of what we are going to discuss, and that is really the importance of good academic writing in various academic works. Importance of good academic writing in various academic works. Ladies and gentlemen, as discussed earlier, scholarly and intellectual academic writing seeks to communicate the process and outcome of research. And this communication through academic writing needs to fulfill certain requirements coming from the basic features of science and research. Therefore, scholarly or intellectual or academic writing needs to fulfill certain requirements, ladies and gentlemen, such as communicating the significance of research question, adequately describing the research process, describing the research outcome, and describing the implications of the research and research outcome, ladies and gentlemen. Now, because of such various requirements that academic writing needs to fulfill, academic writing itself becomes important in research. Now, the importance of good scholarly or academic or intellectual writing in documenting research process and outcome is reflected in the views of various researchers. For example, Hinken, 1995, ladies and gentlemen, reviewed scale development practices in the area of organizational studies and indicated that for some of the aspects of scale development, the research papers had inadequacies in reporting the required information. Thus, in one instance, Hinken, 1995, page 971, notes that the manner in which researchers reported the item generation process may do a disservice due to the omission of important information regarding the origin of measures. Now, this process should be succinctly and clearly reported. That's what Hinken 1995 says. Now, Mitchell 1985, while concluding a paper that evaluated correlation-based research in organizations, he noted that more thorough reporting, innovative measurement, and pre-research planning is needed. You'll find that on page 205. The aspect of more thorough reporting seems to pertain to academic writing as a part of research. George and Wall, 1989, in his works, page 162, studied how reviewers approach the task of reviewing academic research papers submitted to journals. Now, in assessing the review process, they included items such as the reviewers pointing out problems of conveying meaning and how to better focus a manuscript. Now, these items indicating what reviewers focus on while reviewing academic research papers can reflect aspects related to academic writing, scholarly writing, intellectual writing. Now, Witten, 1989, draws on his experience as the editor of the Academy of Management Review to outline the list of questions that reviewers raise in assessing conceptual papers, and the list includes the question, is the paper well written? Further, the importance of academic writing is also reflected in the practice that the checklist provided by journals to the reviewers for assessing the goodness of a research paper at times includes a rating dimension related to the writing of the paper and may require reviewers to focus on the various aspects of writing, such as organization and research, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, as I move towards the end, towards closing, I want to tell you that the expectations of good research reporting are reflected in some of these views that I've just discussed. And this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, suggests that good academic writing may help a researcher to convey his research process and outcomes more adequately and to fulfill the requirements of science and research, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me, ladies and gentlemen, at this material time, to give you a summary, and I will close at this point. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, these are the issues that we've been discussing. We have discussed scholarly academic writing as part of the research process. We have discussed scholarly or intellectual academic writing, seeking to communicate the process and outcome of academic research carried out by a researcher. We have attempted to deal with academic research as an approach to knowledge generation, following certain norms of science. We have also looked at a set of terms with specific meanings and set of steps which are associated with the academic research process, ladies and gentlemen. Then we have also looked at the terms and steps associated with academic research, which constitutes the substance which academic writing seeks to document. And as the substance of academic writing is research process and outcome, and as research and science have certain distinctive features, academic writing needs to fulfill certain requirements. Academic writing also, academic writing works can take various forms and various views in the literature, highlighting the importance of good academic writing. And we've looked at all those things: theory building and theory testing, conceptual papers and empirical papers, if you remember. And in our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen, we'll provide a more detailed description of the various academic writing works. It will also describe the structure and content aspects of two academic writing works, namely conceptual research papers, ladies and gentlemen, and empirical research papers. I want to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending our lecture 2 of scholarly writing for publication. And I want to invite you to our lecture 3, ladies and gentlemen, structure and content of a research paper. And we shall be discussing conceptual papers, empirical papers, and thesis and dissertations. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending this lecture. I wish you well, stay safe, bye.